There are at least 5 provisions of this treaty that are simply incompatible with the standard operating procedures of the United States Navy. For one, this treaty obligates states parties to reserve the use of the seas exclusively to peaceful purposes. Last time I checked, we don't do that. It similarly obliges you not to engage in threats to the territorial integrity or political independence of any nation. That would be news to some of the nations that we have used the seas, for example, Afghanistan or Iraq, to affect certainly the character of their regimes. How about the obligation not to steam for submarines in territorial waters except on the surface and showing the flag? Or how about the prohibition on collecting intelligence and engaging in other kinds of operations of a sensitive nature in territorial waters? Or how about the idea that we will exclusively reserve marine research for peaceful purposes? Ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you we can't not operate the United States Navy, certainly not the way we need to today, and adhere to those obligations. So what does that set up? It sets up a situation in which the United States Navy is encouraging the United States Senate to affirm this treaty, to approve the ratification of this treaty, knowing full well it will not honor the terms, at least in those 5 respects. Now, is that a problem? I must tell you, having worked on a treaty or two in my time, I think it is a problem. I think it is a problem anytime. A democratic polity. I mean, look, totalitarian systems, and Baker Spring is an expert on these, violate treaties that they enter into solemnly all the time. It's just not, generally speaking, a good idea for democratic nations. Why? Because people like United States senators, and certainly like Supreme Court justices, take a dim view of freely embraced obligations being violated. And even if that's not the case, and it is, what you can be sure of is these mandatory dispute resolution mechanisms, including the ones that I've just mentioned, will be used to enforce compliance with these provisions. Now, you will have been told, almost certainly, and we will discuss at greater length, I'm sure, the proposition that the Navy will simply exempt itself from these dispute resolution mechanisms. Therefore, it can violate with impunity the provisions of this treaty. Again, I don't think that's how it's going to work. It certainly is not going to work for the Navy's civilian auxiliary, if you will. They will not be exempted. And I think it's unlikely even that the Navy itself will be allowed to exempt itself. Why? Because, among others, I'm reasonably sure the State Department's lawyers will consider this to be bad practice. Or maybe it's the Justice Department's lawyers, or maybe it's the White House counsel. Maybe it's not under this administration, though this administration did insist that Medellin be enforced. But maybe it's the next administration. Do you want to bet your United States Navy that I'm wrong? I hope not. At the very least, I find it unimaginable, certainly irresponsible, for a committee I had the privilege of serving on a while back, the Senate Armed Services Committee, not to conduct intensive hearings, including with opposition witnesses like those here today, to investigate these questions. Let me conclude by simply making one other observation. The Secretary of the Navy, David Winter, is today, I think in his public statements, but certainly in those that are not so public, making known that he has 2 very real concerns about the Navy and its mission. One is Communist China, the rising power in the Pacific, a member of this treaty that is violating it every day with impunity. Precisely the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Totalitarians can get away with that sort of thing. The other concern the Secretary of the Navy, I'm told, has is the degree to which environmentalists are currently impinging upon the Navy's operations and their ability to conduct their missions. That's under today's ground rules. Imagine when a treaty, another obligation of which will be to preserve and protect the marine environment, is binding upon the United States. And I'm sure that Chris will talk more about the environmental implications of this, but you can bet that those dispute resolution mechanisms are going to make the Secretary of the Navy's life and those of his military counterparts infinitely more difficult if the United States Senate gives its advice and consent to this treaty. I earnestly hope it will not, and I hope by the time we're done today, you will agree. Thank you very much.
For more information, log on to heritage.org.